I'm Rantasmo, and Persona 4 needs more gay. I love Persona 4! Persona 4 is so good that I literally became depressed after I finished it, because it was over. It is that good. Seriously, if you haven't played Persona 4 yet for either the PlayStation 2 or PlayStation Vita, you should probably stop watching this and go play it. I am going to avoid giving away too much of the story here because it really is something you should experience for yourself. One thing that's really interesting about this game is that it's one of the first to tackle LGBT issues in a semi-thoughtful way. And I say semi-thoughtful because while it is really groundbreaking and compelling, it's also kind of frustrating. The story is centered around a parallel world full of physical manifestations of human thought. And much of the game involves doing battle with your party members' shadow selves, which are basically these monsters that represent their most secret desires and fears. One of these characters is Kanji Tatsumi, a macho, aggressive thug, whose shadow self is an effeminate, mincing stereotype who hangs out in a gay bathhouse.
Tonight I'll introduce a superb sight for those searching for sublime love that surpasses the separation of the sexes.
And to me, this is actually fine. It makes a lot of sense. Because a big part of questioning your sexuality is not just stressing over how other people will perceive you, but how you perceive yourself. And no small number of closeted people go through a period where they worry that being gay involves being this.
Goodness gracious, just imagine the things that might happen to me there. Woo!
So it would certainly appear that Kanji's repressing some deep-rooted issues regarding his sexuality. But here's where it gets a little confusing. After you defeat his shadow, and Kanji accepts that this is a part of himself that he's been avoiding, he basically goes, "Oh, actually, none of this had anything to do with my sexuality, it just represents my fear of rejection over the fact that I enjoy sewing." What? The rest of the game never really takes a hard stance regarding whether or not Kanji is actually gay. He's strongly implied to have a crush on Naoto Shirogane, a character who presents as male but is later revealed to be biologically female. Naoto's a little bit confusing too. It's never really made clear whether the character is actually transgender or just a girl in disguise. I personally see her as genderqueer, but that's kind of the problem. It's so ambiguous that the burden is put on the player to draw their own conclusions. You could chalk this up to Japan having a different view of gender and sexuality that's less focused on assigning labels. But I've also heard the exact opposite, that the Japanese developer was actually really specific about Kanji being gay, and that it's the English localization that made it more ambiguous. You could also make the argument that this is a game about high schoolers, and this is a time when plenty of teens are still figuring themselves out, and haven't quite left the questioning stage yet. But it just seems weird that the writers would treat these issues with such kid gloves in a story that's otherwise really good about wrapping up every single loose end. What I think is really interesting though is the way that the other characters in the game react to Kanji's perceived gayness, especially when compared to the anime adaptation. In the game, Kanji's friends seem for the most part very accepting of him, regardless of his sexuality. One character, Yosuke, does make a few cracks that basically amount to, "Hey, you're not gonna try to butt f me, are you?" But the character comes across as kind of dense and immature, and I think that anyone who went to high school can attest to that being fairly believable. But the way the bathhouse scene plays out in the anime is, frankly, unconscionable. The characters still ultimately accept Kanji for who he is, but not before an entire episode full of homophobic jokes. Not just from Yosuke, but from everyone. The whole party freaks out at the idea of going into a place where there might be a gay person. Like, what kind of Victoria Jackson bullshit is this? The characters very nearly attack Kanji's shadow just for being a gay stereotype. Again, plenty of teenagers are plenty homophobic, but the way it's framed, these are the characters we're supposed to identify with. Even the player character acts super homophobic, and he's the one who's supposed to represent you. Persona 4's appeal is that it makes you fall in love with the characters in spite of their faults, empathize with their struggles, even if they're unclear, and want to learn more and more about them, but that can only happen when they're not all being giant dicks.